All right, we can go ahead and get started, and then we'll take questions as they come in. So if you have any questions for the webinar today, just feel free to submit them in the chat box or the Q&A, and we'll get to as many as possible. Also, if you're watching on the IABC Houston Facebook page, feel free to submit questions there, and we'll get to as many as we can. First off, I want to say thank you for everyone that is joining today's webinar. We're really excited about this, and I hope you're staying safe during this time. I want to go over some upcoming dates real quick to go ahead and mark on your calendar. First, the regular deadline for the Bronze Quill Award entries is actually tomorrow, April 24th at 11:59 p.m. There will be a late deadline, but I encourage you to get the discounted rate by submitting your entries by tomorrow. Also, we will have a virtual Networking 9 dinner on Wednesday, April 29th, and there are just a few spots left available. This is a members-only event. If you want more information, just visit iabchouston.com or contact our president-elect, Haley Ross. Also, the southern region for IABC is having an open call for speakers. If you are interested in speaking at the conference in Denver this October, please visit the Southern Region website or contact Mary Hardin Francis. And last but not least, our next chapter-wide webinar will be on Thursday, May 28th, and more details will follow soon on ibchouston.com. And now to introduce our speaker, Stacy Wilson is an IABC fellow, and she helps organizations get more collaboration and innovation value through content and improved use of technology. While she primarily focuses on internet and digital workplace strategy, governance, usability, content, and adoption, she also supports clients' broader internal communication strategy and management needs. Clients are from around the world in many industries such as DaVita, XL Catlin, Newmont Mining, Occidental, and University Hospitals of Cleveland. She has been president of Elocore Consulting in Colorado for nearly 2 decades. And Stacy, thank you so much for joining IABC Houston today. We are really excited to have you. And also thank you for all you've done to help make masks for the COVID-19 pandemic.
Oh. Yeah, that's my side job right now. Actually, it's my full-time job right now at the moment, but yeah. No, it's my pleasure, definitely. For those of you who don't know what Austin's talking about, because my client projects have stopped during the shutdown, I've been sewing masks for a local hospital. So I'm up well over 400 now. And that's if you guys are interested in learning more about the hospital that I'm sewing for, I'd be happy to talk a little bit about that. But let's dive in. Thank you so much for the introduction. And I'm just very sad that I can't be there live and in person and we can't all be together. I was really looking forward to being in Houston, but hopefully another time we'll be able to do that live and in person. And thanks to everyone who's joined. Really appreciate your taking your time out from your day as well. I'm going to go ahead and share my slides now, if that's okay. All righty. So, it's funny, I was thinking this morning that when we originally titled this, I was really going to kind of wrap around a little Olympics theme, and now we don't even have that to look forward to, which is unfortunate, but yeah, that's where the word gymnastics kind of came from originally. And so what I'm going to talk with you about today is really grounded in some of the work that we've done for a lot of years for clients and have been working on recently, right up until the shutdown. So, as you mentioned, we can take questions along the way. So if anybody has any, just drop them in the Q&A and we'll try to address those along the way. I think, your intro of me is dead on. I've been working of late a lot more on the kind of broader internal comm strategy and content areas, at least in the last 12 months. But a lot of the work that I do has to do with digital workplace, which now I think we've all had a really clear example of why that's so important. So that I anticipate is going to be a significant focus over the next couple, 2-3 years maybe. as organizations have finally had the classic example in this crisis of why they need to make that work well. So what I want to talk about today, which again were the items listed in the description for the session, a little bit different order, but I do want to talk with all of you about helping those non-communicators in the organization to improve their work around content. We'll talk about some of the low cost or no cost approaches for you to start using right away. And I want to show you some really interesting work that I've been doing with a client just recently, but is some work that I've done on and off with clients over the years around using country culture research to help us really hone messages more specifically to individual countries. And then we'll just finish off with a little bit of insight into some of the internal resources that maybe you haven't thought about tapping just yet. So let's jump in. There we go. So, you know, when we talk about helping those non-communicators, I mean, our role as communicators has really shifted, and now we are curating content from a lot of people in the organization, and sometimes outside the organization as well. We are not doing all of the content creation. And so we need to help others improve. And really, if you think about it, everyone wants their content to be read, to be consumed. So if we focus on that and really push that desire, I think that anyone who's creating content for consumption by others will want to do a better job. So that's what this is really going to focus on. And one of the things that we know is reading on screen is where we consume most of our information now. And this lockdown has made that even, I think, more apparent. And the way that we read on screen is very different than how we read on paper. So we need to understand some of what we've learned in more recent research about that. And these little bits that I'm going to give you are really useful to use with non-communicators, people who don't have the educational background, the experience that we have, to help them do a better job. So you hear this all the time. We scan rather than read on screen. That's really important because we don't consume each individual piece of language the way that we do on paper. So we have to start writing for scanners. This is a really important one, and if it's the only thing you take away from today's conversation, it should be the one. But we tend to read the first 2 to 3 words of each line, whether that's a bullet or the first line of a paragraph or a headline, whatever it is. That may be the only bit of that line that we read. And so we need to write for those 2 to 3 words, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. We only consume about 28% of what's on the screen. So when it comes to text, less is more. And this has been the case also in paper reading to some degree. It's just more pronounced with on-screen reading. So the volume, it becomes really, really important for what we're trying to get across. Fatigue is issue with the eye and reading on screen. So we need to be really aware of the volume that we're trying to throw at our readers. We'll often read a title and an abstract, and I'm sure we're all reading a lot of news now. So this is very, very typical. We don't go and read the whole text. We'll consume little bits and pieces, snippets of content instead. And so that makes it a little bit challenging for us. You know, we think back to journalism training and the lead, writing the lead, and what is a lead in an article, for example, may not actually be the best thing for you to provide for an abstract in some sort of consolidated online presentation of titles. So we often recommend writing those abstracts separately from your actual article lead. And numbers are really important in scanning. So when it's data that we want the reader to capture and retain, we need to use the numbers, the numerals, instead of spelling them out, even if it starts a sentence. We'll talk more about that. And I know that just makes us all cringe, but we need to use the numerals appropriately so that those jump out for the reader and they can see them more readily as they're scanning. So some takeaways that I would encourage you to use with your non-communicators in the organization to help them improve. Three really important things, and that first one is that first 2 to 3 words. So they need to make sure that those first 2 to 3 words of each line, if you will, first line of a paragraph, a bullet, a headline, a subhead, those first 2 to 3 words are the most important for getting the message across. We want to encourage them to use bullets. Reading on screen, again, I mentioned, is a fatigue issue, and bullets help to break up that fatigue. But we don't write bullets as whole sentences. We write them as fragments. We try to limit each bullet to just one idea and limit the total number of bullets that are presented. So they're a really great fatigue busting device, but they also have to be used appropriately. So that's really, I think, number 2 for helping those non-communicators improve their content. And then this one, some of you have heard me talking about it before, using highlight techniques like all caps, underlining, and italics changes the shape of the word. And even on screen, we read by shape of the word. So when you change the shape of the word, it slows the reader down. And we're trying to consume so much content these days that just the sheer volume is really a concern. So whatever we can do to speed that up for the reader is really valuable. If you need to emphasize something, I recommend bold, because bold actually does maintain the shape of the word, whereas all caps, underlining, and italics all changes the shape, and that will slow your readers down. So if we get these 3 things embedded and lodged in their heads, and get them really paying attention to these when they write, that's just going to make things so much better. If you can get them to pay attention to the 4th thing, this is a tough one, and I'm sure that some of us are going to have arguments with people over it, but it is actually really important from a speed issue, a reading speed issue. That one space after the period is so important for keeping the reader on pace as they read through the content. And this is true for what's on paper as well as what's on screen. And I know that some people are uncomfortable with that change, but it will slow down your reader if you use 2 spaces after a period. So the research is pretty clear on that. So those 4 things we'd love to get our non-communicators focused on. If you've got a little extra attention from them, I would work with them on these last 2 items, and that is removing unnecessary words that we can pull out without altering context, without affecting the real comprehension and messaging. And then simplifying. Simplifying, again, is going to increase speed. So the faster we can move the reader through the content, the better off we'll be. So let's talk just quickly about some of the low cost or even no cost approaches that you and those non-communicators out in the organization have access to right now. Things that can help to improve the quality of content and help your readers. So we're going to focus on 3 things. One is counting words or word counts. That's around the volume issue. Another is testing grade level. And the other one is to differentiate your editing passes. this can be especially useful for those of us who work in communication, but it's also a technique that can be really helpful for those who don't necessarily work in the communication field. So let's talk about word count. Word count is very easy. This is just an example in Microsoft Word, which you can easily pull up word count, character count with or without spaces. And I'll give you a little background on this text that I'm showing. This was a project that we did with a client and fairly recently. And we were working with a pretty large volume of content for them. It was originally written for print, but it had been moved online and was not working very effectively for them. In the course of working across this large body of content, we were able to reduce the overall volume by a third. So removing a third of all of the content while maintaining the context and the messaging. It's technical, you can probably tell. It's from the gas and electric industry, but it's technical language. So there's only so much that you can do with that, obviously, but word volume definitely has a lot to do with comprehension and our ability to consume content. So focusing on reducing that overall volume is really important, and it's an easy thing for you to do, and it's an easy thing for you to teach your other content contributors in the organization to do as well. Working with that same example, again, this is another little tidbit of content from that same project. We were able to reduce the grade level in this technical content by anywhere between 2 and 3 grades, depending on the section of content. So we went from someone really needing a graduate degree to understand the content to someone who was more at a bachelor's level. And that can be really valuable. Obviously, with non-technical content, it's even easier to get that grade level down. And this is, again, built right into Microsoft Word. So this example, you can see the readability statistics. It uses the Flesch-Kincaid grade level. So if we can test for that and look for ways to reduce that grade level, reduce the complexity, reduce the words that we're using in terms of their level and sophistication, it will help speed the reader through the content and hopefully allow us to reach more readers with that content, readers of a broader educational background. So that's, again, a really easy thing to do. It is something that you can teach your content contributors all across the organization. And there's no reason that you couldn't start doing this right away. And the one thing, we're looking at technical content here, but the one thing I do want to emphasize is the reading level in the US average is 6th grade. So particularly for our organizations that have employees on the front lines who are not necessarily at a high reading level, this is a really important one for us to pay attention to. Technical content is one thing, but for the non-technical content, really, really important for us to try to push that grade level down as much as we can. And then I wanted to talk a little bit about different editing passes. This is a technique that can really help you refine your content. And the way that we use it is we're running content for a client project through multiple editing passes. Obviously, you have the one we're most common with, are most familiar with, around grammar and spelling. We bust those out separately. Grammar and word count comes together, so we're trying to reduce word count while at the same time doing what we can to make sure that grammar is clear and appropriate. But I do want to mention with regard to grammar that the language is constantly changing. So there are some things that, 20 years ago the grammar police would not want us to be doing today. So we do have to be kind of open to those changes in the language over time. And digital presentation of content is really changing the language a lot, again, because of the way we read on screen. So we have to be kind of open to some of those changes and not be too hardcore on policing the grammar. And then obviously spelling. And then that first 2 to 3 words that I talked about before, we do that as a separate editing pass. It's a really valuable step to take. I think perhaps the most valuable of all of these. And then we look at the numbers, and I mentioned the numbers before. And then we look at delivery. So this is going to be things like construction of bullets. Perhaps there are visuals that can be incorporated. And the way that we're actually delivering on screen. Is it optimized for mobile? You know, those kinds of things. So these are the different editing passes that we do to make sure that we're delivering a good quality product. So the country culture piece I wanted to bring to you because I think it's a really interesting, exciting leverage of research that's been around since the 70s. And in the slides, and I will provide these at the end to Austin so he can post them for everyone. But I've got some resources for you relative to the country culture research. So if you want to grab onto this and use it for your own organization, I would encourage you to do that. This is work that we were literally doing right up before the shutdown. And in particular for a client that recently acquired an organization with about the same number of employees. So they essentially doubled the number of employees overnight. But the other change was that the acquired company had a significantly different geographic footprint. They were in really different countries than the acquiring company was in. And that meant that we needed to kind of understand those differences between the different countries and do some interpretation around how that might change the way that we communicate with employees. So the research and what we have been focusing on with clients includes 6 dimensions, but I'm just going to focus on 5 of them here. And just this is kind of your crash course in Hofstede's country culture research. So power distance is the ability of people to accept that power is held unequally. So we have some people that have a lot of power and some people that don't. And so the ability of the organization to, the people in the organization to accept that fact and move forward and work with it in place. High number here indicates a very great dependence on the boss. So they've accepted that power distance and they really depend on their boss for direction and decision making. The second dimension is individualism, and this one's kind of obvious. You know, the individualist cultures are very much about freedom and challenge, whereas the collectivists are more about individual use of their skills as part of the team and those physical conditions that they're working within. The third one is masculinity. So we have the masculine versus the feminine culture, and you can see the differences there. Again, a high number there is more of a masculine culture. The fourth one, I think this one's really interesting, uncertainty avoidance. So the extent to which people are comfortable with ambiguity or situations that are unfamiliar that make them uncomfortable. And a high number here is illustrative of their discomfort, very high level of discomfort with uncertainty. And the fifth one that we're focused on in this particular example is the long-term orientation. So do the people in that particular country have more of that longer-term, future-oriented perception versus the short-term, you know, looking at what's going to happen just in the next few months. And so you'll see the differences here. So this is the study that we were doing with one of our clients just recently, and you can see the different countries at the bottom. The blue on the kind of darker blue on the left is that power distance. So again, the extent to which we're comfortable with power inequality. The red is the individualist versus collective. The green is the masculine versus feminine. The purple is that uncertainty avoidance. So we want to avoid uncertainty because we're not comfortable with it. And the long term is that lighter blue. And there's not data available for every country for that, which is why you see some don't have it. So this was a really interesting view. And what I want to do is bust out just some of the dimensions to focus on, which is what we did with the client. And I'll explain why we did that. In terms of prioritizing messaging, we decided based on the country view, there were 3 areas that we really needed to prioritize country messaging. And the first one was around individualism versus collectivism. So it's that I versus we focus. And the reason that we put this number 1 is because it was the most dramatic difference between the countries. The second one was that power distance. So again, that was kind of our second most dramatic difference between the different countries represented. And then the third one was the uncertainty avoidance. So we'll look at each one of these quickly. So in the individualist, so this is whether or not we're an individualist society or a collectivist, and look at the difference between the US operations and the operations in Chile. That's a huge difference. And so you're dealing with these 3 countries, Peru, Ghana, and Chile, who have a very, very different profile here than the US, Australia, and Canada. So we have to understand that difference and then use that to adjust our messaging by country. Power distance was not as big a difference, but it's still a pretty significant difference. You've got several countries down here in the 30 to 40 range. That's Australia, Canada, the US, and then very high acceptance of power inequality in Suriname in the kind of 85 range. So a dramatic difference there. And then the uncertainty avoidance was the third one that had some pretty dramatic differences. Whereas in the US, we're much more comfortable with ambiguity and being, we're just comfortable with not knowing exactly what's gonna happen next. In Suriname, again, not comfortable with that at all. So some stark differences. The other interesting thing about this is that these differences did not follow region lines for the client, and they had been predominantly communicating by region. So that meant within a region, we needed the communications teams in the region to do more differentiated communication by country. We also recognized that the decision-making models and approaches differ by country. So the way that leadership is leading and making those decisions is going to be different country by country. So that complicates our communication a little bit as well. The other interesting thing about this is that the ability of a country team to be innovative or good at implementation is going to vary. And this comes back to that uncertainty avoidance. If they are very uncomfortable with uncertainty, they'll be great at implementation, not so good at innovation, and vice versa. Those that are very comfortable with uncertainty, great at innovation, not so good at implementation. So that is another thing that from a communications perspective, we want to understand. So a couple things that we did in the process just to make it easier for the communications teams to think about is to group into the short-term individualist countries and the very dependent, anxious, collectivist countries. and differentiate how we're going to communicate to them. So for those short-term individualist countries, we're communicating around individual benefits rather than the team benefits that the others would be getting more focus on. We can more comfortably go directly to employees with messaging, whereas on the other side, we're communicating through managers and supervisors predominantly. So you can kind of see the differences. I won't take the time to go into each one, but what we're doing is we're taking that country culture research and the findings for that particular organization, and we're translating it into ways that the communications team can change the way that they're communicating, that they're messaging, in order to reach people more effectively in those countries. And then the last thing that I will spend just a little time on here is your internal resources, and then we can see if there are any questions. So oftentimes we try to work in our own communication bubble when there may be resources in the organization that we haven't really thought about tapping, and how we could tap them to improve content, to understand more about our stakeholders and how we can customize to their needs. So some of the groups that over the years I have worked with clients to leverage in the organization and include, for example, their research teams. So they may have teams doing different kinds of research within the organization, and there may be elements of that research that's very applicable to what we're trying to accomplish around messaging and content. So if you can become more aware of what those teams are actually working on, and make sure that you're privy to the results that they're turning out, that could prove to be very beneficial to you and your team. So I would encourage you to really try to get connected in with those groups in the organization. Another one is many organizations have librarians or taxonomists. So taxonomists are the folks who work with words and how we use words online for search and findability. So to help us find things. Taxonomists typically come out of a librarian educational experience. And some organizations even have, regular librarians, not necessarily taxonomists. These folks have a real understanding of the language that's used in the organization. And so they can be really helpful to us for understanding more about what those words and phrases are and how we might use them effectively in our messaging. So they're a great group to tap, and I definitely would encourage you to seek them out. Another is the community relations, and in some cases they're community developers. I've busted them out into two groups, but it's really useful for you to tap into these folks because they're out in the broader community. So in terms of external stakeholders, they're going to be able to help you understand a lot more about what that external community is thinking about, what their concerns are, and what kinds of language and words they're using, so that we can understand more about customizing our content and our messaging for that external community. And then the last one is, of course, on government relations, and this is going to be also very interesting relative to country culture. Government relations operates differently from country to country, and the experience of the government relations team will definitely differ from geography to geography. So that's a really good team to connect with, and again, understand more about what's going on in their world and how we can modify our messaging to support what they're doing, even when we're bringing that messaging back for employees to understand what's happening in the relationships that we have with governing bodies. So that's a really useful group to tap into as well. So that is kind of a quick run through, but I definitely wanted to leave some time for questions. I do have, again, the reference list in the slides here, so you'll be able to find not only information about the country culture, but also I've got a couple of great resources for some of that online reading and usability information. Nielsen Norman Group and Human Factors are two that I definitely would recommend that you connect with. They both publish a lot of great content all the time about the research that they're doing. And it's really useful stuff for us to understand how we need to change things for online consumption. So Austin, it looks like we've got a question from Shay. Hi, Shay. Can you give us some examples about goals and measurement from some of these cases? Oh, yeah, definitely. So let's talk first about goals and measurement around the actual online reading piece. So one of the things that we have done with clients in the past is to focus around actual comprehension. And comprehension really comes when we'll take employees as an example, when the employee can actually explain a particular topic to others in the organization, then we consider that beyond awareness to actual comprehension. So one of the things that we have done to test for that is some random polling after a particular campaign to identify what percentage of the employee base can actually explain that particular topic to others. And that's a really useful piece to understand, so that we're making sure that we're really getting the message embedded at a deeper level than just awareness, because I can be aware all day long and it doesn't mean that I change my behavior. And so the behavior change is the other one that I wanted to mention in response to Shay's question. When we're looking at metrics, we want to go beyond that awareness to actual behavior change. So we want to see how is the messaging actually shifting. So for example, if you take right now, now would be an interesting time to test and look at how are employees changing some of their behavior based upon the information we've been providing around things like personal safety, social distancing, those kinds of things. So we want to look at behavior change, and behavior change can be also just as simple as, for example, employees making better use of an online registration for internal training. It doesn't have to be something complicated, but we want to look at changes in behavior around business process, around personal behavior, and certainly the business side too. So are there metrics that the business is capturing that we can influence? So looks like we've got a question from Alice. Where does translation fit into the country culture messaging challenge? Yeah, Alice, that's an interesting one. And that's something that my client is definitely grappling with, because with this acquisition, they have several countries that they're now going to have to be translating for that they were not doing a lot of translation before. Because most of the countries that they were operating in operate in English, including, for example, Ghana. Ghana's national language is English, even though they have other languages in the country. Their formal national language is English. But when we start adding some of these other countries in that don't readily speak English, and a lot of their frontline workers are not going to have that language, they're definitely having to look at translating a lot more content than they've been before. Certainly, some of the translation tools are getting better, which is great, but we need those to get even better before we can heavily rely on that sort of auto translation, electronic translation methodology. So still, the ones that are doing it best are using internal employee resources to provide writing and editing support to get all of that content that you absolutely need to translate into the other languages. So it's a great question.
And I do want to jump in real quick. So I actually worked in Oman for a few months. And, I think when I went over there, it was a little bit different culturally, just on how we communicate, like verbally. I think, we just have different tendencies. And actually, when I was flying home, I guess for a week before flying back over there, I actually picked up this book. It's called The Culture Map by Aaron Meyer. And so if there are people out there, I would encourage you to maybe pick up that book or a similar book. I think it gives really good insights into how to just communicate across cultures. Stacy, is there any sort of resource or book that you have found helpful in your time?
Yeah, so the one by Geert Hofstede and Geert Jan Hofstede, Cultures and Organizations, there's a newer for them version, 2010, Cultures and Organizations, Software of the Mind. That is, I think, a great kind of introduction to how to think a little bit differently about country culture and how that influences your ability to communicate effectively. And I'm just going to pop out of there and yeah, so I think I'm not sharing anymore, right?
No, you're not sharing.
Yeah, okay.
But we do have some more questions coming in. This one, first on Facebook, Tracy says, it's great to see you. She says, nice to see your smiling face, so that's good. And then on Zoom, we have Deanna. She said, what suggestions would you have to implement or introduce some of the content strategies to non-comms employees?
So, yeah, we have actually done some training in the past for non-communicators in the organization. And this can be done as just, a half day, couple hours, because we're really just trying to embed some of those really basic content techniques for them. And it is the kind of thing that can totally be done online. But we find that when we pitch it to those folks as a way to ensure that they're not wasting their time on their content, that they're actually going to get more people to consume that content, they're really interested in that. And I almost think that doing it online is actually better, because then they're not sort of having to publicly admit and show up in a classroom that they maybe need to improve their content ability, because everybody likes to think that they know how to write and they know what they're doing, right? So that can be a really effective way to help them. One-on-one coaching is also a great approach for people who are really creating a lot of volume of content for the organization. We do this a lot with HR, because HR tends to create a lot of content. And so they're a group that we tend to do a little bit more kind of one-on-one hand-holding with. The other thing that can be really effective is kind of a drop-in workshop. So if you people around the organization who are working on content projects, give them kind of a regular day and time that they can drop into, even a Zoom meeting to ask you questions. They might have specific pieces of content that they need some help with. And so it's almost like being sort of an editor on call to work with them one-on-one. So yeah, those would be some of the suggestions that I would make for working with those non-communicator folks. Now, Alice has come back with another question about, you always have to get professional translation and then have internal check it. So if you're doing professional translation, Alice, you're absolutely right about having an internal resource check that. And the reason for that is that those translation firms typically do not have a really deep understanding of your industry and the terminology and the acronyms and the things that come with your industry. And so it's really important for us to have employee reviewers whose first language is that translated language, so that they can double check all of that. And this is how we typically do that. And it depends on the content as far as whether or not it goes through a translation firm. I have clients who have operations, for example, in South America, and they do most of their employee communication in Spanish. And a lot of that content they're actually having their Spanish speaking employee folks in the communications team down there drafting in Spanish. So it's, not having to go out to some sort of firm first because the resources are right there on the ground to do that. So it just kind of depends on the situation. But way back when I was still with Sprint and I was responsible for the annual report, we translated the annual report into 9 different languages. And I had employee reviewers all around the world doing those reviews. We did have a firm that would do the initial translation, but then those employee reviewers were really intimately involved in making sure that all the content was correct.
I think in the press, we're starting to see kind of a transition into this smarter writing style. I mean, we've seen, Axios come about with their smart brevity approach. Do you think this is kind of helpful for us to start seeing that in things that we read, in key news, news pieces, and then maybe translate that to our professional careers as well?
Yeah, and I think that's actually a really good observation, because I think that's part of what's kind of pushing a lot of us to be more comfortable with these changes in language and changes in how we write and approach the content development process, because we are seeing more and more of it, whether it's in social or, like you said, the media kind of picking up on some of that. The reality is if we're going to produce content, we obviously want it to be consumed. And in order to ensure that happens, we're going to have to do things differently from how we've been doing them before. The more we understand about the readability research too, I think the more people feel comfortable making those changes. 20 years ago, we didn't really understand that much about how people consume content on screen. And so we've just leaps and bounds moved forward in our understanding and appreciation of that now.
Good response. And I see that we had a question come in from Jason asking if this recording will be available to revisit later. And the answer is yes. It's currently streaming live right now on Facebook. We'll upload the full video on our digital platforms. We'll also send that out, plus the slide deck tomorrow to our IABC Houston distribution list. And we do have another question that just came in from Shay Sullivan. She asked, an internal check also accounts for any regional differences in the language. For example, I worked on 2 different projects that had African Portuguese audience, but we had to be very cognizant of the difference between Mozambique and Angola. And yeah, I definitely think you have to be aware of those cultural differences.
Yeah, and so she's talking language differences too, but also cultural differences as well. And that was one of the interesting things in this work with our client just of late, is the recognition that the way that they're structured organizationally by region is not necessarily a good matchup for the country differences. So regionally, your region teams, if you have regional communication teams, which this particular client does, they're going to have to start thinking a little bit differently about how they produce their content. They can't just do it as one big mass of content for the region, because those differences in culture and language are going to dictate that they do more customization.
All right, we've got a few minutes left. So if you have any more questions that you want to add, feel free to drop them in the chat box or also the Q&A box. And Stacey, I know that you did mention this beforehand, but for people that are maybe interested in, additional coaching from you, maybe working with you, maybe following up with questions via email, social media, what is the best way for them to get in touch with you?
So also in the slides is a contact page that's got all of my contact information. But I mean, really, you can reach out to me in any way. I'm on LinkedIn a lot, Twitter, or just email me. You know, whatever works for you. I'm happy to respond to. And you know, definitely, especially right now, looking for some client work to pull me back out of all my sewing. Yeah, so we can get some projects spun back up and going again. But yeah, definitely happy to respond to people's questions, and would be delighted to work with anyone who's interested in having some outside help and support.
I think you've provided some great tips today, and I hope that people on the webinar have, taken a few nuggets that they can use in their day-to-day careers. We do have another question that just came in from Alice Brink.
Yeah.
She said, "How challenging is it to help communicators with different countries understand the nuances of culture when they are embedded in it?"
Yeah, so that's a great question, Alice, and I've found that that's one of the things that this research can really help you with. If you use the research to help them get comfortable with the idea of these differences, country culture differences. The research that Hofstede has done is based on IBM, originally based on IBM. IBM, of course, had employees all over the globe, and they were collecting a lot of very interesting data from all of those employees. And that was sort of the original foundation and basis. Now, since that time, there have been a lot of studies to kind of fill in gaps in the IBM research. But it's nice to be able to go to a team in a particular region and work with them on, you know, these are what we're seeing in some of the research, and how we can translate that to our communication effort, and help them begin to appreciate how they need to differentiate across their region. I think that some are more apt to buy into it than others. I have found certain parts of the world are more ready and eager to learn and to improve. They don't necessarily think about themselves as all-knowing and already being more capable than anyone else. And then there will be some teams that will be tougher, that will think that they already know everything they need to know, or that they're so insular within their geographic area that they don't need to bust out of that. Those are tougher groups to pull along. Yeah, so it's going to depend on the team, and it's going to depend on the team's leadership as well. So the more you can connect in with that team's leader, if you bring them along, then that'll help to make a difference.
Alice, thank you for the question. We do appreciate it. And again, thank you for everyone joining this webinar today. We hope that you got some valuable insights from Stacy. And if you want to connect with her on LinkedIn, just search Stacy Wilson. Also, you can follow her on Twitter at Stacy L. Wilson. And then, of course, tomorrow we will also send out the recording of this webinar, as well as the slide deck as well. So you can get all the information at the palm of your hands, and also reach out to Stacy if you have any comments or questions. But I do want to provide a few more reminders in case you missed the start of the webinar. The regular deadline for the Bronze Quill Award entries is tomorrow. That's Friday, April 24th at 11:59 p.m. There will be a late deadline, but we encourage you to get the discounted rate. Also, we will be having a call for judges here within the next few weeks, so stay tuned for that. If you'd like to attend the next virtual Networking 9 dinner, that's going to be next Wednesday, April 29th. I think we have 2 spots left, so please contact Haley Ross, our president-elect, if you'd like to join that as well. Also, from Mary Hardin Francis, if you are interested in speaking at the Southern Region Conference in Denver, please contact her. They are looking for speakers. And last but not least,
and Austin, if I can just add to that, we are still working on the conference. Mary and I just talked this week, and I am actually working specifically on the keynotes. We're moving ahead. At this point, we're assuming that we'll be able to to hold the conference here in Denver. So fingers crossed. If anything changes, obviously we'll get information out about that as soon as possible.
Yeah, fingers crossed on that,
Yeah,
that we'll have a
yeah.
conference. And also for those that don't know, the IBC World Conference has now moved to a virtual 3-day conference. So visit IABC.com for information on that. And Stacy, really appreciate you for joining us. And for all those that are watching this webinar, whether it's on Facebook or Zoom, we'll be back here May 28th for another webinar. And just stay tuned to IABCHouston.com for more information.
Thanks so much, everyone.